Thank you for having me. So as mentioned, I am a dermatologist. I also have a little bit of eczema. So I know what it's like in a small way because my eczema is not too bad. My talk is going to be focusing a little bit more on management and more importantly, myth busting because there's lots of myths. So this is what eczema is. It's a dry, scaly rash. It can affect anyone from 1 day old to 101 years. It tends to be in the thin areas of the skin, so your neck, your elbow creases, the backs of your legs, but it can be anywhere as well. And so, as mentioned, eczema, about 1 in 5 Aussie kids have eczema. As time goes by, most people's immune system matures, eczema gets better, but it's still something that's very common. As I was saying, it's important to seek medical care, at least in the first step to get a diagnosis. So there's stuff that I tell people to do all the time, and then there's stuff that they should do just during the cleanse. So the most important thing is to have realistic expectations. So a lot of people think that the eczema is going to go away, but it doesn't. The tendency towards eczema is always there. And so, as I mentioned, for a lot of people, it gets better as time goes by, but you will always have that predisposition towards eczema, and it can flare up at any time. So it's not about curing the eczema, it's about controlling. So it's just like asthma. You can't get rid of asthma, but it's about controlling it. So one of the things that I struggle with is people often get told, oh, don't use the steroids for more than 7 days. Day 8, you're still going to have eczema, so then what are you meant to do, right? So one myth to bust is that there's no time limit on steroids. I've had eczema, I've been using steroids for years. It's just one of the things. Yeah. So then in terms of your moisturizers, ideally you want something that's thick and greasy and doesn't have any fragrances or perfume or food products. So a lot of people think kind of natural things are best, but that's definitely not the case because that is a perfect recipe to cause food allergies. So we'll come to allergies in a little bit, but what happens, we think at the moment, is that you've got a defect in the barrier function of your skin, and then if you put food on top of that, the food gets introduced to your body through your skin rather than through your gut. And so that can lead to food allergies down the line. So food allergies don't really cause eczema for most people, but eczema can predispose to food allergies. And that's why it's really important to stay away from things like turmeric or other food products. But then the other thing you also want to avoid is things with unnecessary fragrances or preservatives, because there's a small chance of getting allergic to those things. So just keep it plain and simple. The bland, cheap stuff is often better than the fancy, expensive stuff. So things like QV or Vaseline or Dermies, any of the plain boring stuff is great. And so the thicker and greasier, the better. But as someone who has eczema myself, I know that the thick, greasy stuff is feral, and I am adult and I'm a dermatologist. I still hate putting on my moisturizers, especially in winter. First thing in the morning, it's cold, you're in a rush to get to work. If you don't let the moisturizer sit in, it gets all over your clothes and then you feel gross for the rest of the day. So I 100% understand the struggle. So with moisturizers, there's kind of, broadly speaking, creams and ointments. So if something is an ointment, it's oil-based. So you can leave it, a bottle of olive oil in your kitchen, it'll never go off. Whereas if you left a jug of water outside, eventually it'll turn green. So things that are water-based, bugs can grow in them quite easily. So then you have to add preservatives, and then you have to often add fragrances to hide the smell of the preservative. And so creams are great because they melt into the skin quite nicely, but they have lots of extra ingredients. Whereas if something's an ointment, it'll be oil-based. So you don't need as many of those additional products. And because it's an ointment, it often will get taken up by the body a little bit better because it's oil or lipid base, I should say lipid, hydrophobic base, and our skin is hydrophobic, or at least the outer cell layer is. So like attracts like. That's a very long-winded way of saying ointments work a little bit better, but then and so if you have really severe disease, I think ointments are the way to go, but maybe it's not so bad, then creams might help a little bit with actually being compliant. If it's not, struggle to put it on each day, then maybe you're going to be a little bit more diligent with putting it on and then keep things under control. So a plain greasy emollient 2 or 3 times a day. Sunlight is actually a good way of dampening down inflammation of the skin. So that's good for dampening down eczema, but then it also dampens down the function of your immune system and can predispose to things like skin cancer. So there's a bit of a delicate balance with that. So one of the questions I get a little bit is about probiotics. Click along for me. A little bit of evidence for next slide. Probiotics. So these are it's a bit of a sciencey heavy slide, but pretty much it's looking at the benefits of probiotics, and it seems to be that there's a little bit of benefit. The tricky thing is that this is kind of a summative, lots of different individualized studies. Each of them uses slightly different probiotics, so it's very hard for me to say go and drink your Yakult, because the probiotics in your Yakult might be a little bit different to the ones in the studies that you can see on screen. But I suppose from my perspective, it's something that's relatively cheap, low risk of harm, and if it helps a little bit, then fine. And so one of the other things which gained a little bit of interest was bleach baths. And so there was a few individual studies which seemed to show that they could help, but then when you pool all of the studies together, it just seems to be so helpful. So I think that some patients with bleach baths really do make a difference, and I think it's often those patients who tend to get recurrent infections, but then there's other patients where it doesn't really do that much. So with all of these things where there's kind of an evolving body of evidence and low risk of harm, I say give it a go, and if it works for you, great. So that's just stuff to do all the time, right? So plain greasy emollient, soap-free washes like Dr. Phil said, avoiding unnecessary products, a little bit of sunlight's not a bad thing either, and then there's what to do when your skin flares. The first thing is that you don't need to be scared of using corticosteroids. As long as they're used in a supervised way, the chance of running into trouble is very, very low. So it's not impossible, it's not zero, but it's very low. I think maybe in patients once a year. So we do have alternatives. We've got a class of medications called calcineurin inhibitors. There's another class called PDE4 inhibitors. And then there's different strengths in steroids as well. So I mean, chat to your doctor. There's often different things that we'll use for the face compared to the body, or around delicate skin like the eyelid. That's one area where I'm a bit careful with steroids, not because I'm worried about the skin, but I'm worried about the steroid getting absorbed into the eyeball. And then you can use steroids once a day. You don't need to use them twice a day. So they've done a few different studies and pooled all the evidence, and it seems that using the steroid more than once a day doesn't actually help with getting on top of the eczema, but it doubles or it halves how long your tubes last. That's one little cost-saving trick. And then there's no problems with using it over broken skin, and there's no problem using it over infected skin. So there was a really good study by some GPs, and they looked at the management of infected eczema, and they gave some of the patients steroids, and some of the patients steroids plus topical antibiotics, and then antibiotics in tablet form, and just using topical steroids was there. So those are for most of the patients with mild and moderate. Things I guess to mention, because the whole point of today's topic is the cost of eczema, is the tubes are not cheap, right? And they're only 15 grams. There are some formulations which come in bigger tubes, like 50 grams. And then if you have quite a big area of disease, you could also get more than one tube for that price. So it's not available to every single person. Obviously, we have a limited healthcare budget and we can't pay for everyone's everything. But if you have fairly widespread disease, then you might be eligible for some of the subsidized treatment that way. And then if you're kind of got really, really widespread disease, there comes a point where it's impractical to put, topical treatments all over you. So there's a treatment called phototherapy, which is administered by dermatologists. So most of the bigger hospitals will have that available and available publicly. I think a lot of private practices have it now as well. And so that's a treatment where you go into a light box, which is different to solariums. Solariums use ultraviolet A. We use ultraviolet B in a very specific wavelength. And that can help minimize inflammation in the skin. There's traditional immunosuppressants, and then also the newer ones that Dr. Phil alluded to for people who have the most severe eczema. But I think there's lots of steps before that. I think for the vast majority of patients, if we just optimized all the simple stuff, so the good use of moisturizers. So I had a few other slides, but I guess just to echo what we were mentioning before, so eczema is not just the eczema itself. So as Dr. Phil alluded to, for little kids, it uses up a lot of their energy and their calories with your skin turning over and being red and inflamed. So those kids can not grow as well as they should. If you're not sleeping at night because you're constantly scratching, it can lead to problems. There was a study which came out in the last month or so, which is saying kids with really bad eczema sometimes have trouble at school. If you have head to toe eczema, all your blood's going to your skin and it's not pumping around your internal organs, so that can actually be very dangerous. With eczema, you have breaks in your skin, and so then bugs can also get in. So I've mentioned infections before. You can get bacterial infections. So one of the questions is, do I need to get any special tests done? So most of the time, eczema is a clinical diagnosis. If in doubt, doctors can actually do a little procedure where they remove a piece of your skin and get it analyzed under the microscope. That can add benefits in terms of diagnosis. There are other things that if you have a very funny pattern of eczema, sometimes it can be something that you're coming into contact with. So that can be a cream or an ointment or a shampoo or a makeup product that you've used your whole life, and then one day your body decides to become allergic to it. You can also funnily get allergic to the sun or particular wavelengths of light. So there's tests called photo testing. One of the things that people will often present to a dermatologist with is allergy testing, which is not the tests that are correct. Eczema isn't caused by food allergies, but eczema can predispose you to food allergies. So this is not a fringe viewpoint of me. This is multiple different international bodies, and they all say very similar things, which is that you shouldn't put people on bad restricted diets because they're not helpful. The blood test and the skin prick tests aren't the correct tests to do. So they are the tests for food allergies, but not for eczema. Eczema that's caused by food allergies. But then the way to do that is, as mentioned before, with a dietitian and an immunologist, following a elimination diet. So that's about it for me. So this is my Insta. It's just Dr. Deshan.